Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Vali Nasser, the Dean of Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, and I'm delighted to welcome everyone to the David H. Bernstein Forum, which is an important institution established at SAIS by the Bernstein family in honor of the school's longtime friend and patron and member of our advisory board, David Bernstein, who's with us today. The Bernstein Forum brings to SAIS leading foreign policy leaders and thinkers to engage our community on critical global issues. And in that context, we are honored to also welcome back to SAIS Tom Friedman, an internationally acclaimed author and journalist who needs very little introduction, but nevertheless, here it goes. He's an award-winning journalist and has authored 7 best-selling books. He won 2 Pulitzer Prizes for international reporting, one from Lebanon and one from Israel, and his 3rd Pulitzer was for distinguished commentary in 2002. In his role as a foreign affairs columnist for the New York Times since 1995, Tom has covered issues in international affairs ranging from globalization and environmentalism to international economics and energy. Today's conversation will focus on his latest book, Thank You for Being Late, Today's Optimist's Guide to Thriving in the Age of Accelerations. It explores the tectonic movements that are reshaping the world today and how we can get the most of them and similarly to cushion their worst impacts. It is one of the most vital and relevant pieces of work that you will read and should be required reading for all global leaders of today and tomorrow. Moderating the conversation with Tom will be Laura Blumenfeld, a senior fellow of the Philip Merrill Center for Strategic Studies here at SAIS. And I would like to thank Laura for organizing today's event and for her role in the school's curriculum and programming. And thank you all for joining us. And now please welcome Tom and Laura to the stage.
Thanks, all. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Nasser, and thank you all. Thank you, Tom. I want to introduce you to Tom as a Professor Friedman for today, because this truly is a master class on the world in the age of accelerations, which is the topic of Tom's book. Thank you for being late. And I guess the way we would start off any course at SAIS is with the very basics of organization. So Tom, I guess my first question to you is, you know, when a chef walks into his kitchen in the morning, he organizes alphabetizing the spice rack. And when a lawyer walks into his workplace, he might assign client numbers to his cases. You walk into the New York Times every day, and your assignment is the world. How does somebody organize the world?
I don't know. You know? First of all, Laura, it's great to be back here with you. Laura and I have been doing jazz together ever since Jerusalem in 1985. So this is a real treat for me. And Dean Vali Nasser, it's great to be with you too, and be here with SAIS. So I have a teacher, Lynn Wells. He's a systems analyst at the Defense University, and Lynn likes to say, and I have adopted, never think in the box, never think out of the box. Today you must think without a box. And that is the abiding framework that I use to try to understand the world. So let me just do a quick sort of overview for you, and I think then everything I say after that will really make sense. I think the world is being reshaped, that it's not just changing, it's actually being reshaped by the fact that we're in the middle of 3 nonlinear accelerations all at the same time with 3 largest forces on the planet, which I call the market, Mother Nature, and Moore's Law. So Mother Nature is climate change, biodiversity loss, and population growth in the developing world. If you put them on a graph, they look like a hockey stick. The market for me is globalization, but not your grandfather's globalization. That was actually containers on ships and planes. Put them on a graph, they look like a hockey stick. Lastly, Moore's law, that the speed and power of microchips will double every 24 months, coined by Gordon Moore, the co-founder of Intel in 1965, still alive and well 53 years later. And when you double something every 24 months for 53 years, you eventually get to some very high numbers. Put Moore's law on a graph, it looks like a hockey stick. So another way to explain how I look at the world is I think we're in the middle of 3 climate changes at once. We're in the middle of change of the climate of the climate. We're going from what I call, thanks to this acceleration, from later to now. So when I was growing up in Minnesota in the 50s and 60s, later was when I could clean that river, purify that lake, rescue that orangutan. I could do it now or I could do it later. Today, later is officially over. Later will now be too late. That is actually a climate change. We're going through a change in the climate of globalization because of what's going on in the market and that acceleration. We're going from an interconnected world to an interdependent world. And in an interdependent world, you get a geoeconomic inversion. Your friends start to be able to kill you faster than your enemies. If Greek and Italian banks had gone under last night, this room would have been half full. Wait a minute, Greece, Italy, they're in the EU, they're in NATO, they're allied. Yeah, they could kill us in an interdependent world. And in an interdependent world, your rivals falling can be more dangerous than your rivals rising. So if China had taken 6 more islands in the South China Sea last night, I wouldn't have felt, much one way or another. Had China lost 6% growth last night, this room would have been empty. That's a climate change. And lastly, we're going through a change in the climate of technology. Every company can, and therefore must, analyze, optimize, prophesize, digitize, customize, automatize. They can do all of this now, which fundamentally is changing the nature of work, okay? So we're going through 3 climate changes at once. That's why people feel so unmoored right now. And what do you want when the climate changes? So you want 2 things. You want resilience. You need to be able to take a blow, because stuff happens when the climate changes. And you want propulsion. You want to be curled up in a ball under your bed, waiting for the climate change to pass. So as I thought about that, I thought, well, who do I go to for advice on how you get resilience and propulsion when the climate changes? And I realized I knew a woman. She was 3.8 billion years old. Her name was Mother Nature, and she dealt with more climate changes than anybody. So I called her up, made an appointment, went out to see her. I said, Mother Nature, how do you produce resilience and propulsion when the climate changes? She said to me, well, Tom, I have to tell you everything I do unconsciously, but these are my strategies. First of all, she said, I am incredibly adaptive. In my world, it's not the strongest that survive. It's not the smartest that survive. It's the most adaptive that survive. And I teach this, Laura, through a very brutal process I call natural selection. You may have heard of it. Secondly, she said, I'm incredibly entrepreneurial. Wherever I see a blank space in nature, I fill it with a plant or animal perfectly adapted for that niche. I'm so entrepreneurial. Third, she said, I'm incredibly pluralistic. Oh, Tom, she said, I'm the most pluralistic person you've ever met. I love diversity. I try 20 different species of everything. I see who wins. And she told me something very interesting, Laura. She told me that she noticed, and I can see it in this room, that her most diverse ecosystems are her most resilient and propulsive ecosystems. I love diversity. Fourth, she said, I'm incredibly sustainable. Everything is food, eat food, poop seed, eat food, poop seed, nothing is wasted. Fifth, she said, I build feedback loops into all of my systems, so I'm very attentive. Sixth, she said, I believe I'm incredibly hybrid and heterodox, nothing dogmatic in my views. I'm really hybrid and heterodox. I'll try any trees with any soils, any bees with any flowers. Seventh, she said, I do believe in the laws of bankruptcy. I kill all my failures. I return them to the great manufacturer in the sky and take their energy to nourish my successes. And lastly, she said, my healthiest ecosystems are all the ones that learn to build complex adaptive coalitions, where the different elements of the ecosystem network together to maximize their resiliency and propulsion. So my basic view, and I'll end here, is that the university, the graduate school, the company, the country, and the community that most closely mirrors Mother Nature's strategies for building resilience and propulsion when the climate changes is the one that will thrive in the age of acceleration.
You're saying average is over, you can't just adapt or die?
Yeah, I mean, it's when you're in the middle of this kind of acceleration, adaptation becomes one of the most important life skills.
It sounds kind of overwhelming. I almost feel like I'm at Six Flags and there's that warning sign if you have like neck, back, or heart problems, do not strap yourself on. Everything's accelerating at once. I mean,
well, I think that's why a lot of people feel unmoored right now. People's identity is in play. I mean, basically, people, I think what happened in America is that, metaphorically speaking, people went to the grocery store sometime in the last decade and the cashier had a head covering that wasn't a baseball cap. They then went into the restroom and there was someone of a different gender next to them. And then they went to work and their boss just rolled up a robot next to their desk and it seemed to be studying their job. And all of these happened at once. So their sense of national identity and home came into play. Their sense of social norms, what is right, what is tolerable, came into play. And their sense of their work identity came into play. All this happened at the same time. And that's why you had all these politicians who emerged to say, I can stop the wind. All these things that have unmoored you, I can stop the wind. We had our version, the Europeans had their version.
so these three forces have come together and they're influencing international affairs in what you call a post-Cold War.
Yeah.
Right? In the Cold War, your allies could help you. In the post-Cold War, your allies can kill you, as you mentioned with Greece. Take us a little bit on a tour of the world. Maybe offer a cheat sheet for the Secretary of State.
Sure. So this is how I look at geopolitics today. My chapter in geopolitics actually built on the 1960s sitcom Get Smart. I'm sure some of you are my age. You saw Don Adams. He was a spoof on James Bond. He had a shoe phone, Agent 99, Agent 86. Can anyone tell me what organization Don Adams worked for? Very good. You get a free book later, okay? He worked for an organization called Control. Do you remember who his worldwide enemy was? Chaos, spelled K-A-O-S, okay? Now, I got this point from Laura, okay, because she was the one, when I described my theory to her, she actually directed me to this show. I believe the writers of that show were ahead of their time, because I think in the age of acceleration, the most important geopolitical divide is no longer east-west, north-south, communist, capitalist. It's between the world of order and the world of disorder now, the world of control and the world of chaos. So why is that? Well, basically, had SAIS existed, 150 years ago, SAIS would be teaching you the politics of empires, because the world was largely governed by empires. And then, as a result of decolonization in World War I and the results of World War II, the world got divided into all these nation states. And suddenly we woke up in 1946 and we had 190-some nation states all represented in the UN. The 50 years after World War II were a great time to be a weak little state. Oh, if you were a weak little state, that was your era. Why? First of all, there are two superpowers throwing money at you, giving you foreign aid, building your government house, and educating your kids at Patrice Lumumba University in Moscow or Wichita State in America. You could be Syria and lose 3 wars to Israel and get your army rebuilt for free all 3 times. Climate change was very moderate in that era. Everyone had a demographic dividend, lots of young people, a few old people, and populations had not fully taken off. And lastly, and most importantly, China was not in the World Trade Organization. So everybody could be in the textile business. All of those positives completely flipped in the early 21st century because of my 3 accelerations. So now no superpower wants to touch you because all you win is a bill. From their point of view, number one. Number two, population has exploded in the developing world, and now a lot of people in the developed world have demographic deficits, lots of old people and few young people. Climate change is now hammering countries. I did a documentary last year for National Geographic on human migration in Africa from Senegal through Niger up through Libya to Europe. Senegal is already at 2 degrees rise average temperature since the Industrial Revolution. 2 degrees rise average temperature. Where have I heard that number? Oh, 2 degrees rise average temperature is what the Paris Climate Agreement was signed to prevent by 2100. So Senegal is there today. They're going to 4 degrees rise. And lastly, China's in the World Trade Organization, so nobody can be in the textile business. I was in Egypt for Tahrir Square. I was there for 3 weeks, and then when I was done, I went home. I was a late night flight. I was at Cairo Airport. I went to the Treasures of Egypt's souvenir shop to buy my honey a little souvenir to remind her where her honey had been for 3 weeks. So I looked around. Let's see, pyramid ashtrays. No, my honey doesn't smoke. Sphinx bookends. No, my honey's got plenty of bookends. But then I saw they had a honking humped camel. And if you squeezed its hump, it honked. And my honey did not have a honking hump camel. So I bought the honking hump camel. I took it over to the cash register, turned it over, and of course, what did it say on the bottom? Made in China. Yeah, you're the lowest wage country in the Eastern Mediterranean, and there's now a country half a world away that can make your honking humped camel cheaper than you can, ship it, and make a profit. So these 4 changes have basically eroded the foundation of all these weak little states. Some are blowing up, some have become utterly fragile and are hemorrhaging people. And what you're seeing is the creation of vast zones of disorder. In our hemisphere, ground zero is Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. By the way, the 3 most deforested countries in Central America. They chopped down their trees, we got their kids. And across the ocean, it begins in West Africa, goes all through sub-Saharan Africa, up through North Africa, all the way to the border of India. And the biggest thing happening in the world today is the mass migration of people trying to get out of the world of disorder into the world of order, fundamentally changing the politics of the world of order. And therefore, in my view, if you're Secretary of State, the biggest challenge you have today is how do we basically help stabilize the world of disorder? Because I believe many, many more states will fail because of these accelerations. I think it's the central geopolitical issue of our time.
And you talk about in the book you say how during the Cold War it was about managing strength.
Right.
Our challenges were ones of power and strength, but today it's weakism.
Yeah, right.
It's managing weakness.
Managing weakness. And managing weakness is hell on wheels. You know, I mean, because you call another leader in the world and you ask them to do something and they pull a lever and it comes off the wall. You know, in the Cold War, I mean, think about Henry Kissinger negotiating peace in the Middle East. He dealt with Hafez al-Assad, a one-man, totally in charge dictator in Syria, Anwar Sadat, a pharaonic leader in Egypt, and Golda Meir, who was so overwhelmingly dominant, their Labor Party, no one had ever even heard of the Likud Party. Your Secretary Kerry today, and your assistant is Laura Blumenfeld, and who are you dealing with? In Syria, there are 18 different governments. In Egypt, you have a sort of frightened military dictator. And in Israel, you got Bibi Netanyahu, but you got Bennett measuring the carpets in his office every day, and he's afraid to take a chance on anything. So there's just managing weakness is hell on wheels, and it's I'm afraid, what a big part of our foreign policy is about today.
So moving to your subtitle, An Optimist Guide. So
drugs, Laura, a lot of drugs. Don't tweet that as a joke, please.
And chocolate.
Get me in trouble with the New York
chocolate.
Times. Yeah.
But an optimist. Tom, I've known you for 30 years, and you are the optimist from Minnesota. And so I want to just ask you, because we've been watching the world for decades,
Yeah.
and every time you do come out on this side of optimism, whether it's Oslo or Tahrir Square or even most recently Saudi Arabia, right, the reforms in Saudi Arabia. Where are you today? Are you still...
Well, I confess, if I were writing a journalistic autobiography today, it would have to be called Nobody Left to Root For.
Nobody left to root for.
So I'm sort of, Charlie Brown and the football and Lucy, show me some hope somewhere and I'll chase after it. That's just who I am. It's how I'm built. So the real story about this book is it has an emotional backstory. And the backstory is that I did spend a lot of my journalism career covering the Middle East. And basically everything I rooted for has kind of failed. You name it, I rooted for it, it failed. Oslo, democracy in Iraq, Arab Spring, reform in Saudi Arabia. If this were baseball, I'm batting 0-0-0, and so I kind of emotionally came home to America, and I wrote a book with a former Johns Hopkins professor, Michael Mandelbaum. I took my ball home, and I said, I'm going to focus on America, nation building at home. So Michael and I wrote a book that we spoke about here a few years ago called That Used to Be Us, how America lost its way in the world it invented and how we can come back. And then I woke up a couple of years ago and I looked at our politics and I realized the Middle East had followed me home, that we have become Sunnis and Shiites. We call them Democrats and Republicans, but basically we have become as tribalized as the people I ran away from. And so the reason this book ends with Minnesota and me going back to the small town in Minnesota where I grew up, that was the source of my optimism, is I wanted to go back there, first of all, to see whether I just made it all up. You know, kind of you remember your youth in a gauzy way. And so I went home and I interviewed all my friends, all my teachers who were still alive, all my neighbors, all the mayor and the superintendent, to try to understand this remarkable place where I grew up, this little town, which I'll talk about in a second. To see, first of all, if it was real, and second of all, if there was something going on there that I could then take back kind of to the national scene, because I was out of ammo, basically. And that's what triggered the book. So for those of you who haven't read it, I grew up in a small town outside of Minneapolis called St. Louis Park. The basic story of my youth is that my grandparents immigrated from Eastern Europe in the early 20th century. My mom and dad were born in Minnesota, in Minneapolis. And in Minneapolis, all the Jews in the 30s and 40s lived in a ghetto in the north side of the city with African Americans, not because we were integrated there, but because we were isolated together there. Minneapolis was the capital of anti-Semitism in America until Hubert Humphrey became mayor and cleaned it out of city government, a real hero in our house. And anyways, after the war, the Jews were able to escape the ghetto. Between 1953 and 1956, virtually the entire Jewish community of Minneapolis moves to one little town on the edge of the city called St. Louis Park. It was the only town that didn't have restricted covenants on who you could sell a house to. You could sell a house to Hebrews, and they had enough houses to take the whole community. So my aunt and uncle moved 2 doors this way, my other uncle moved a door that way. An entire community, en masse, moved in 3 years to one town. So overnight, a town that had been 100% white, Protestant, Catholic, Scandinavian, became 20% Jewish, 80% white, Protestant, Catholic, Scandinavian. If Sweden and Israel had a baby, it would be St. Louis Park, okay? And thus began a really interesting experiment in inclusion. It was as if God said, let's have some fun. Let's take these Jews of Minnesota, we called ourselves the Frozen Chosen, and we'll throw them together with these pluralistic Swedes, and we'll see what happens. And so in my little town, we had these, again, neurotic Jews shot out of the ghetto with these pluralistic Swedes. And we built a pretty interesting community because I actually went to high school, Hebrew school, and grew up in the same sort of 8-year period with the Coen brothers, the filmmakers, Al Franken, Norm Ornstein, Michael Sandel, the political theorist. We were in Hebrew school together. Sharon Isbin, the guitarist, Mark Trestman, the coach of the Chicago Bears. He was our high school quarterback. It was a freaky place. We have our own Wikipedia page. This was not an apartment house in the Upper West Side of New York. This was a little one high school town in Minnesota. And the Coen Brothers movie, A Serious Man, was about our town. And if you saw No Country for Old Men, you may remember a scene where Churga blows up a car outside of a pharmacy in Mexico to go in and steal drugs. And at the end of the scene, the camera pans to the pharmacy, and it's called Mike Zoss Drugs. That was our little St. Louis Park drugstore. So I tell the story because it had a huge impact on all of us because we grew up in a time and place where politics worked. My mom was a radical left-wing Democrat, and my congressman my entire life was Bill Frenzel, a Republican, and my mother would never not vote for Bill Frenzel than she would for the Man in the Moon. And Bill Frenzel would run, I got to interview him before he died, he was at Brookings for the book, and he would run every year, and his sign would simply say, Frenzel for Congress, billboard, and it would never identify what party he was from. So just to finish this one point, so that was the kind of place I grew up. So it had a big impact on all of us. Sandel took it into communitarianism philosophy, Franken into politics, Norm Ornstein, the Coen brothers into film. I mean, it had a huge impact on all of us. And it's this thing that if you're not from Minnesota, you don't quite understand. That's called Minnesota Nice. And Minnesota Nice is complicated, also covered for a certain amount of racism there. I can go deep on it. But there is a civic culture there. And it's hard to explain Minnesota Nice to people who aren't from Minnesota. I tell 2 stories in the book. One is home for a wedding, and my best friend Ken Greer and our mutual friend Jay Goldberg was there. I sat down with Jay at the wedding, and Jay said, Tom, my wife Eileen was driving on the ring road around Minneapolis today, and a driver almost drove her off the road. And Jay told me that Eileen came home and said, Jay, I was so mad, I almost honked. So that's Minnesota for road rage. And when I was growing up, my dad, there was a Jewish mafia in Minneapolis around Prohibition. My dad grew up with these guys. I swear he wasn't in the mafia. But when I was 5 years old, my dad came home one day and told me one of his friends had been sent to jail. And when you're a 5-year-old kid, you come home and your dad says he knows someone who went to jail. That freaks you out, which is why I never forgot what my dad said when I said to him, Dad, what did he do? And he said, son, he was shopping in a store before it was open. That's Minnesota for breaking and entering. So that's where I grew up. And basically, I tell the story of that community lore, and then I leave Minnesota in 1971 to go to college and go on a career. And the last chapter of the book, I come back to my little town 40 years later. And I left in 71 to discover the world, and I came back and found the world had discovered my little town. Now my high school is 50% white Protestant Catholic Scandinavian, is 10% Jewish, 10% Latino, and 30% Somali. Because the same little town that took the Jews 40 years later took the Somalis. And I tell the story about how they're now trying to build a community together. And ain't that the story of America? And ain't that the story of the world? But I use this whole little example and wider Minneapolis to talk about what is actually working in America. What was working in Minneapolis? And that was that they had built, that's why I started with my climate change rap, they'd built a complex adaptive coalition. That if you want to be an optimist in America today, stand on your head, because where the country is working are communities that are able to build complex adaptive coalitions where local leaders, business, labor, educators, philanthropists, social entrepreneurs, and local government all network together to create a coalition to thrive in the age of acceleration. And that's why the end of the book actually ends and connects to the front of it.
A positive note
Yeah.
also, yes. So my question is America still America? This America that you went to discover, is our America still the America we all love? Because, for example, with China, in your column that you wrote about recently, you said that to take on China, Trump asserts that we're the big dog and China, China's number 2 to us, that we need to sort of double down on what we consider our strengths, right? Immigration, alliances, our values.
Yeah.
And I noticed you put in sort of parentheses or in ital, if we still stand for those things.
Yeah.
So are we still the America you're talking about?
Well, I don't like to get too dark. I mean, I can ruin any dinner party, and I do weddings and bar mitzvahs too, whatever you like. But it's and you can get carried away on this, but I think, I just think we have it's no secret. Our president is a deeply disturbed person, and what's disturbing is how many people are ready to follow a deeply disturbed person. So, but I still believe the country is the country, but you can't look at what's going on today and not be deeply troubled by a president whose business model is to divide us and not bring us together, and the number of people, the Lindsey Grahams in the world, who suddenly sign up for that parade. And that's deeply troubling to me. So I would just be blowing smoke if I said, no problem, it's okay, everything's going to be fine. It's not. Because the local communities that are working, Laura, what they all have in common is that they produce what my friend Giddy Greenstein calls leaders without authority. These actually what distinguishes one community. Why does I profile Lancaster, Pennsylvania? Some you may have seen in the summer. So Lancaster is here. Here's Reading, York, and Harrisburg. I mean, they're all basically the same. Lancaster has taken off. Forbes named Lancaster one of the 10 coolest cities in America. This city was dying 20 years ago. The other 3, flat on their back. So why does one community build a complex adaptive coalition and one not? Anyone looking for a PhD thesis, I guarantee you that is really fresh meat. And they have this phenomena, and it's a mystical, magical thing, leaders without authority. People in the community who simply stand up, say, not going to let this happen, and I'm going to work with you, and you're going to work with me, and we're going to check our politics at the door, and we are going to make this place rise. And So that they're out there, I know, but I think that our institutions can survive 4 years of Trump. I don't think they can survive 8 years.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you. You wrote the book before Trump was elected, and you talked about.
I was writing it while all this was happening.
While this was happening, and
yeah.
you know, it was almost like running up a down escalator because you kept having to re-interview people because everything kept changing.
Yeah.
But meanwhile, he was coming down that escalator.
That's right.
And what I'm just wondering is, you talk about the three largest forces in the world, right? You give them all M's, right? Mother Nature, Moore's Law, and the market. Whether a fourth M has emerged, maniac, or, you know, as you mentioned, who's further accelerating because the American public can't get enough. They seem to be more engaged with politics, and they're not done, right? All the newsrooms are hiring, right? There's my former editor at the Washington Post, right? Everybody's hiring. And so it seems like into the mix you have the man who commands the largest military on the planet and wields the loudest megaphone, right? Kind of so would you say that there's a fourth?
Yeah, I'm just not.
Is he a symptom rather than a cause?
Well, he is a symptom. He's a byproduct of, I think, so many people feeling unmoored, and then he's a driver of the division because he doesn't see himself as president of all the people. He sees himself as president of his base. And he goes around the country not visiting complex adaptive coalitions and rooting them on. He actually goes around the country having pep rallies of just his base. There is another way for him to behave. You know what I mean? He could actually be going to Minneapolis and to Birmingham and the places where I've gone, to Lancaster, and really shout out people for coming together. And he's doing just the opposite.
Right.
So it's deeply destructive behavior, and I don't want to get into Trump bashing because it's just so easy, and it's just so fruitless because you know, you just got to go out and vote. You know, but it's troubling. You know, I resist the notion, you know, that this is somehow permanent because as I said in a piece last week, I started my career covering a civil war in Lebanon. I never dreamt that I'd end my career covering a civil war in America.
Where we've gone from partisan to tribal.
Yeah, exactly. That we no longer are divided by partisan politics, but by tribes. And so I so resist that I try not to add logs to the fire, yet at the same time, I mean, I did my column for tomorrow. The theme of it is, you know, Trump was at the UN, and he said people were laughing with him, not at him, you know, the other day. And I said, look, I wasn't there, so I can't tell you what they were laughing at, but on the outside, but I'm pretty sure I know what was going on the inside. They were crying. They were crying because they know the America that they grew up with, hoped for, and occasionally took advantage of too. That America has left the building. And I think the implications of that, I just did my column tomorrow, actually it's partly on that, partly on Bob Kagan's new book, The Jungle Returns, that, you know, we had these last 70 years did not happen because of human evolution. They didn't happen because human beings suddenly learned to be nicer to each other. They happened because it happened the most powerful country in the world had an enlightened, you know, philosophy that it was ready to take around the world, not everywhere and always, but in more places, in more ways, on more days. That's why we live in the world that we live in today. And if we don't play that role, if Trump says, I'm not the president of the world, you know, we will sow the wind and we will reap the whirlwind.
So what is he green-lighting? I mean, I know that there was this disappearance in Istanbul of a friend of yours.
Yeah. So I think the whole thing with Jamal Khashoggi is a piece of that, but it's not the only one. Look at all the journalists who've jumped out of windows in Russia. Look at Putin poisoning people in London. Look at Bulgaria the other day. These Bulgarian and Romanian journalists were arrested while literally exposing people stealing money from the EU. In Egypt, how many people have been arrested? We've lost sight. In Turkey, where Jamal Khashoggi was killed, meanwhile, there aren't enough journalists to cover it because half of them are in jail, basically, you know? And so we are giving permission by our absence. You know, we can't make good things happen. I mean, we can help them, but we can't just de novo make good things happen. But by what we do and what we say, we can, at the margins, prevent the worst things from happening sometimes. We can give people pause. And part of America's role in the world, I learned this covering the Middle East, was that people like Netanyahu or people like Begin or people like Assad or people like Sadat, they needed to be able to say to their own extremists in their cabinets, God, I'd love to be with you. But the American Secretary of State was here and he broke my arm. So I just can't be with you. I'd love to be with you, okay? Now, there's no one saying that. In fact, they say Trump says fake news. I can say fake news. Before this terrible story with Jamal is over, I promise you, you will hear the term fake news, okay? So what is that about? And it fits for me a pattern. You know, my whole approach to Saudi Arabia and covering that story is that the choices in a place like Saudi Arabia, they aren't between good and wonderful. You know, they're between awful and less bad, basically. And basically, you have three choices. You could have an election in Saudi Arabia, and God knows who would get elected. You could have the old regime. The old regime was every part of the Al Saud family gets a fief, they get a ministry, and they milk it for their family. And you get reform at 5 miles an hour. Or you can have a modernizing autocrat, basically what you got. Now, we've had modernizing autocrats all over the Middle East. The Ataturks, the Reza Shahs, the Sultan Qabuses, and the Saddams. They were all variations of that. But it's all about where the balance is, you know, between their good impulses and their bad impulses. So with MBS, you know, one thing you can't say about MBS is that he was a fraud. And this guy empowered women to drive. He took the religious police off the street. He let cinema return to Saudi Arabia. A lot of things he really did. This wasn't just on the come. But at the same time, he bought a $500 million yacht. He bought a $500 million painting. He kind of abducted the prime minister of Lebanon. He launched a brutal war in Yemen, thinking he was going to win a war in Yemen in a way no one in the past had ever done that. He had an upside and a downside. And the job, I thought, from the very beginning, was to try to encourage the upside and discourage the downside. It required a really strong American hand. And to this day, we still do not have an ambassador in Saudi Arabia. So let alone a Secretary of State who can engage at that level. That's why when 3 months ago I wrote a column addressed to Trump, it was called Memo from the U.S. Ambassador to Saudi Arabia to the President, subject MBS, if we had an ambassador in Saudi Arabia. So you leave someone like that, who's 33 years old, with some dark impulses and some positive ones, you leave him on his own, and there's a chance that he'll be more Saddam than Qaboos. And I think that's what happened here.
And on balance, before we're going to turn to the audience with a few minutes for questions, but I have to ask you,
Please.
On balance, would you say that things are, you know, the world is good or evil? People, you know, going to the dark side or to the light? Because you've been in the darkest of places, but you've always...
Yeah, I mean, I'm always, I mean, for me, you know, I once wrote about this. I was in Israel. You know, Haaretz runs my column in Hebrew. So that's kind of cool for me. I get my column out in Hebrew and direct into the veins of the Israeli public. And I once asked the editor, why do you run my column? And he said, Tom, you're the only optimist we have. And there was an Israeli general who was there, Uzi Dayan, and he said, Tom, I know why you're an optimist. It's because you're short. And I said, short? He said, you can only see the part of the glass that's half full. Okay, so I'm actually not that short, but I do look for that part of the glass, you know what I mean? So as much as I'm utterly appalled, and I can't express this enough, what Saudi Arabia did to Jamal Khashoggi, as someone who's covered this region for a long time, Laura, I've seen a lot of bad things. It's right up there. It is unspeakable and unfathomable evil. And it will be a stain on that government that will not go away. And as I'm watching that, the next day I'm up at MIT, and they're giving me a tour of the AI lab, and their two top stars are an Israeli AI expert and a Syrian AI expert, and they're both MacArthur Award winners. So that's my life. And so I focus on that, but I'm always trying to work encouraging this. You know, my teacher for the physics in this book is a guy named Amory Lovins. Amory's a great physicist. And whenever people ask Amory, are you an optimist or a pessimist? He says, I'm neither, because they're just two different forms of fatalism. Everything will be great. Everything will be awful. Amory says, I believe in applied hope. And that is my philosophy. I believe in applied hope.
Sounds like a good major.
Don't know if it's going to work, but I'm going to get caught trying. And if you want to criticize me for it, call me naive, you're so stupid, you should have seen this, go right ahead. I really don't care. This is how I came in. It's going to be how I go out.
Great. Well, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
We have time for about 10 minutes. Please introduce yourself. Of course, it's a question, not a statement. I need to start with a woman. Just
Please.
How about right there, Dorothy?
Yeah. Hi, good afternoon. I'm Dee Parvaz with Think Progress.
Sorry, you said you're who?
Dorothy Parvaz, Think Progress. I'm just here just for my own edification.
Gotcha. Just gonna walk into the
so I just want to understand. It seems like you're saying that what happened to Mr. Khashoggi might somehow change the relationship between Saudi and the U.S. So what is it, if I could ask about Mr. Khashoggi, that makes him sort of, puts him above the deaths of thousands of Yemeni civilians and millions more who are being starved to death right now?
There's nothing that does. Every one of these stories and every one of these deaths is equally bad. I don't want to start with the whole Yemen War, because the Yemen War is really complicated. Saudi Arabia has played an appalling role there. The UAE has played an appalling role there. But so has Iran. So have the Houthis, who tried to take over the country. I mean, we could try to sort that one out, all afternoon. All I know is a lot of innocent civilians have been killed there. And you could say, like, well, the press focuses on one of their own. I think this is not an explanation. It's not even a justification. I guess it is more of an explanation. It's that somehow that's a war, and we sort of put that in one bucket. Bad things happen in war, and we occasionally go and cover it. And in a place like Yemen, it starts to become very hard and physically dangerous for journalists. And then there are things like what happened to Jamal that are, that in war, people are going to die. We expect that. But journalists going to apply for visas shouldn't be abducted and murdered. And so it's a little bit simply, it's so out of that particular norm. And we journalists, because we happen to know him, are going to cover that, differently. So, but it's not to in any way change say one is more evil than the other. It's just that the level of aberrant behavior just really stands out more because it isn't in the middle of this war. I have no good explanation for you. It's a perfectly legitimate question, and I'm struggling to give you an answer, but that's what it would be. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, let's do, maybe we'll cluster three. So 1, 2, and then right there, 3.
Yes, sir. My name is Kami Bhatt. I'm with the Pakistani Spectator. You talk about MBS. What do you think about this Pakistani guy, Imran Khan, who was elected recently? He is very westernized, very honest guy. He wants to change the nation. And Pakistani elected him as the last savior. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, country cannot really survive. It cannot pay even its electric bill. What do you think where he is leading this country with 100 atomic bombs?
Yeah,
Thanks.
I wish I could tell you. I'm just not up to date. I've been in Pakistan a long time, and I'm just not up to date. But if he's as good as you describe, I wish him good health and lots of success. Sorry, yeah.
Sorry, my name is Catherine Koch. I'm retired from the Foreign Service. And I wanted to try to tie U.S. leadership today to being late. I'm always late.
You're
and
always late,
how the culture that we're living in, and I think of it on the street because it's like, whoo, be careful or you're going to get
right. Hit by a bike.
Yes, exactly. And how does that culture of today, first of all, I think it is nocive. And that I tell people, younger people, don't have children because they're not going to have jobs. There'll be no jobs, everything will be So how does that, so how does that
talk about, I get the point, yeah.
Thanks.
So again, another subtext of the book, the reason it's called Thank You for Being Late, is that my argument is that in this age of acceleration, my belief is that everything old and slow matters more than ever. all the things you cannot download, all the things you have to upload the old-fashioned way. Good parenting to good child, good teacher to good student, good bureaucrat to good citizen, good preacher to good flock. I really believe all the old stuff matters more than ever. So I'm not on Twitter. I mean, if I want to tweet something, I have to give it to my secretary. I don't know how to get on it. I don't follow it. I occasionally put something out there, and the New York Times tweets my column, but I'm not there. And if you're tweeting at me or to me or about me, y'all have a good time. I'm not there. I have never looked at Facebook. And by the way, I've never smoked a cigarette. And my hope is to actually die free of all of these things, okay? So I talk the talk of technology. I do not walk the walk. I'm a really old-fashioned, I know who my friends are. They're not a thumb up or a thumb down. I really believe that the faster the world gets, all of these old and slow values matter more than ever. And that's why, see, the broad argument of the book is these three accelerations are reshaping your world. They're not just changing your world. They're reshaping the workplace. They're reshaping politics. They're reshaping geopolitics, as I talked about with Laura. They're reshaping community, as I talked about. But they're also reshaping ethics. So I have a whole chapter in the book, which I'll just tell you about briefly because you've asked, and it's very important, on ethics. And the chapter is called, Is God in Cyberspace? And the title of the chapter comes from the best question I ever got on book tour in 1999. I'm in Portland, Oregon, at the Portland Theater selling the Lexus and the Olive Tree. And at question time, a young man stands up in the balcony and says, Mr. Friedman, I have a question. Is God in cyberspace? In 1999. And I said, I have no idea. And I felt like a complete idiot. So I went home and I called my spiritual teacher. He's a rabbi I got to know when I was the New York Times correspondent in Jerusalem. His name's Zvi Marks. He's a great Talmudic scholar. Lives today in Amsterdam, married to a Dutch priest, interesting character. I called him up in Amsterdam and I said, Zvi, I got a question I've never had before. Is God in cyberspace? What should I have said? And he said, well, Tom, in our faith tradition, we have two concepts of the Almighty, a biblical concept and a post-biblical concept. The biblical concept is that the Almighty is almighty. He smites evil and rewards good. And if that's your view of God, he sure isn't in cyberspace, which is full of pornography, gambling, cheating, lying, prevarication, people smearing one another on Twitter, and now we know fake news. But fortunately, he said, we have a post-biblical view of God. And the post-biblical view of God says God manifests himself by how we behave. So if we want God to be in cyberspace, we have to bring him there by how we behave there. Only we can bring God into cyberspace. So I really liked his answer. I put it into the paperback edition of Lexus and the Olive Tree that came out in 2000 when none of you saw it, and it sat there for 16 years. Anyways, I sat down to write this book, and I suddenly found myself retelling that story. So I sat myself down one day and said, why are you retelling that story? And the answer came to me immediately for two reasons. One just happened. I think today in the developed world, we're now living 51% of our lives in cyberspace. That's not where you go to find a date, find a spouse, buy a house, buy a car, get a mortgage, do your banking, do your brokerage, get your news, generate your news, buy your clothes. That's where we're living 51% of our lives now. And what's my definition of cyberspace? It's a realm where we're all connected and no one's in charge. We're all connected, but no one's in charge. There are no stoplights in cyberspace. No stop signs, no courts, no justice, no 1-800, please stop Putin from hacking my election. But that's where you're living 51% of your life, and so am I. And at the same time, because of my three accelerations, we're now standing at a moral intersection we've never stood at before as a human species. In 1945, we entered a world where one country could kill all of us, post-Hiroshima. If it had to be one country, I prefer it to be mine. I think today we're entering a world where one person can kill all of us, and at the same time, where all of us could actually fix everything. We, with the same tools we have now, we've never been here before, one of us could kill all of us, and all of us could actually feed, house, clothe, and educate everyone on the planet if we put our minds to it. Now, we have the resources to do that. We have never been here before as a human species. And what is this place? We have never been more godlike as a species than we are today. So put those two together. You've never lived more of your life in a realm that's God-free, and we have never been more godlike. What does that mean? It means what every person thinks, feels, and believes today matters more than ever. It means every person has to be grounded in sustainable values and at a minimum, the golden rule. do unto others as you wish them to do unto you, because you now live in a world where more people can do unto you farther, faster, deeper, cheaper than ever before. Putin just did unto us in our election. And we live in a world where we can do unto others farther, faster, deeper, cheaper than ever before. Everyone has to be in the grip of the golden rule. So I gave this speech as the graduation address, this part of it, at Olin College of Engineering 2 years ago. And I said to the parents there, I know what you're thinking. You paid $200 grand so your kid could get an engineering degree. And who do they bring in for the commencement speaker? But a knucklehead promoting the golden rule. Is there anything more naive? And what I told them is what I will tell you. In this age of acceleration, naivete is the new realism. Because I'll tell you what's really naive. Thinking we're going to be okay in a world that is this interconnected and men, women, and machines are this super empowered if everyone is not in the embrace of the golden rule. Where does the golden rule come from? Two places: strong families and healthy communities. That's where you really learn to do unto others as you wish them to do unto you. Not an expert on strong families. Do know something about healthy communities, because I grew up in one, and that's why the book ends in St. Louis Park, Minnesota.
Such an interesting point also when you talk about how everyone's so interconnected and interdependent, because you spoke to the Surgeon General,
Yeah.
and you asked what is the #1 health risk for Americans, and he said not cancer, not heart disease,
Not diabetes.
not diabetes. I'll let you.
Isolation. I said, wait a minute. This is Vivek Murthy, who was our Surgeon General, wonderful guy before Trump fired him. And I said, wait a minute, you're telling me we live in the most connected age in history and the biggest disease in the country is depression-related isolation? Absolutely. It's because all these people on their phones, in front of their commuters, you know, whatnot. And that's why I love to get out. I love to talk to people. People, you know, criticize me. Sometimes they say, well, there's no data in your columns. Actually, talking to another human being is data. I kind of learned that a long time ago, you know. And so I'm interested in data too, but I'm also interested in talking to other human beings. And so many of the insights I get that lead me to data come from talking to other people. You know, I would just end with, if you say, where do I get my optimism, Laura? This is maybe the best way to conclude, is that a year ago, August, the head of the U.S. Air Force asked me to take a trip with him to visit all our air bases in the Middle East. Qatar, UAE, Afghanistan, Iraq, Kuwait. It was an amazing experience. It was with him and Heather Wilson, the head of the U.S. Air Force. And as Laura knows, as a columnist, so I'm a column once a week, you know, sometimes on Tuesday night, like tonight, you can be in the right place at the right time. I feel that right now. I'm in America, stories here, you know. And sometimes you can really be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And last August of last year, I found myself in Al Udeid Air Base on a Tuesday night with my column due, and I was in the wrong place at the wrong time because Donald Trump had just given his Charlottesville speech about how they're good white supremacists and whatnot. And I thought, I'm in Al Udeid, I'm up in Al Udeid Dateline, and the entire Milky Way galaxy is talking about Trump's remarks at Charlottesville. So I was staring at a blank computer screen, and we had spent the day at Al Udeid Air Base. We'd flown from Ramstein. And then the column just absolutely exploded into my head. And I did a column basically saying, hey, folks, I'm out here in Al Udeid. Let me actually tell you about my traveling party. I'm actually traveling with Heather Wilson. She's the Secretary of the Air Force. She's a woman. I'm traveling with Dave Goldfein. He's the Chief of the U.S. Air Force. He's Jewish. I'm traveling with their guard. His name is Juan. We just had a briefing from the head of the air war in the Middle East. He's an Armenian American. His deputy is a Lebanese American, and the intelligence briefer was Mr. Yang. Mr. President, which part of this sentence don't you understand, okay? That this is what makes America great. And that this, not this stuff you're talking about. It's our ability to, out of many, make one. And to be with the U.S. Military in that context can be an amazing experience. But you don't have to go to the military to do that. You can see it at MIT. You can see it at SAIS. You can see it in Silicon Valley. And I think we don't celebrate that enough. We don't defend it enough. But that's the source of our greatness. And just ask Mother Nature. I repeat what she told me. My most diverse ecosystems are my most resilient and propulsive ecosystems. think we'll end there.
All right. Thank
Thank
you
you.
very much.